Lynn to help us brainstorm. This is, I think, the fourth of a series of brainstorming sessions. Previous ones have been led by Lou Dunn, by Scott Sagan, and by Heather Williams. And today I've asked Nina Tannenwald to help us get started. And I've asked Lynn Rustin and Jon Wolfsthal to provoke us even more. You've got their bios, so I'm not going to repeat all that stuff. But I do want to wave this book in front of you. This is Nina's book, The Nuclear Taboo. It's even more current than when she wrote it.
Unfortunately.
And, you know, not many of us who write books actually get a chance to write one on like a foundation stone, a cornerstone of the field. But Nina chose wisely. So Nina, come on up here and help us out.
Wait, I have all these.
She's going to
We're
view
mic'd-
graph. I'm going to
we're
sit
mic'd
down
already.
here.
We're mic'd up here. But you're going to need that later. So when you're
So-
So you could just turn that off.
Just turn it off.
sitting. Yeah.
If I put it in
Wait,
your pocket.
I just want to be able to see. I can't crane my neck. I want to see the view graph.
So I'm using this mic? Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Michael. It's really a pleasure to be here talking to you today. Thank you very much for joining us. Michael asked me to kind of open this session by framing it a bit in terms of the global nuclear normative order and what the norms of this order are, how we think about them, what's happening to them, and what it means to talk about a regime of nuclear restraint, and what norms we want in the future. How do we revive a regime of nuclear restraint in the future? Today, I think the key norms that have underpinned the global nuclear normative order are under pressure. And I think we are seeing some unraveling of this order. So that's what I want to talk a bit about today. I just have 3 slides here. Michael encouraged us to be very informal, so I will be very informal. And I just have three slides. And I just want to start by saying it's useful. So this is going to be kind of big picture. You know, I'm the nerdy academic here. I'm going to give the kind of big picture. It's useful to think about the current nuclear order in terms of 2 components. So we can think about it as the global nuclear order and then the nuclear order among the nuclear powers. So the global nuclear order is what we associate with the nuclear nonproliferation regime, the haves and the have-nots. And this is very much about the politics of inequality and asymmetry that take place in the nuclear nonproliferation regime. And this is very salient on the international stage, and this is the one we talk about quite a lot. The second order is the nuclear order among the nuclear powers. And I think this gets a bit less attention, in part because there's fewer states, only 9 states here. And this is centered around issues of relationships of deterrence and issues of nuclear stability. And I think this gets a bit less attention, in part because the issues here are inherently more technical. Issues of strategic stability get very complex quickly, and much of the world actually would like to do away with deterrence rather than preserve it. So those are the 2, I think, sort of 2 big components of the nuclear normative order. And so I want to focus, and I've listed what I think are the norms that go with these sort of big components. So the global nuclear order is about nonproliferation and disarmament, and the nuclear order among the nuclear states especially focuses on deterrence and non-use. And I'll say a little bit more about these in a minute. So we're in a time of change, significant change, technological change, the return of geopolitics. And we nerdy academics have some arguments about sort of what causes norms to change or what makes norms robust. So we can, one argument is that, is the realist argument, which is that when the distribution of power shifts and you have new technologies, you can expect to get pressure on the norms, that the norms are going to change, and that's certainly a situation we're in now. A second argument has to do with institutions. Comes out of liberal institutionalism, and this argument would argue that when norms are embedded in institutions, they're likely to be more robust. So if this is true, we can expect that, for example, the non-proliferation norm, which is embedded in the NPT, is going to be more robust, right? The NPT is quite a major institution. And we can expect that that norm is going to be more resistant to change, more resilient than, for example, either disarmament or deterrence, which don't have any nearly as strong institutional frameworks, right? They aren't nearly as embedded in institutions. So we can expect that those are going to be under more pressure, are likely to change more than the non-proliferation norm. Finally, we can talk about the role of talk and discourse and how people talk about norms. And I think we've seen a lot of this recently in the Trump-Kim Jong-un relationship, where there's a lot of nuclear threat making, a lot of bluster and bellicose rhetoric. And that kind of talk can undermine norms because it shapes expectations. And so this is another factor contributing to the erosion, especially, for example, of the non-use norm. Okay, so the existing nuclear normative order, and let's see. All right, so this is just a slide of various norms that I think, key norms of the regime. So I've got sort of what I would say are the key substantive norms: deterrence, non-use, non-proliferation, and disarmament. Maybe we need the 4 key norms, and then I would add in there the non-explosive testing norm and the peaceful uses from the NPT. Some procedural norms I'm not going to say as much about, maybe my arms control colleagues will, and then norms that I think have gone by the wayside here. So prohibitions on missile defense, treaty-based arms control, perhaps. So let me say something about at least the 4, what I see as the 4 key norms here. So since the 1960s, the existing nuclear normative order has been built around 3 or 4 key norms of nuclear restraint: deterrence, non-use, and non-proliferation. And I would add in disarmament as well, which Obama put on the agenda particularly. And these norms reinforce each other in some instances. For example, extended deterrence helps support non-proliferation. But they conflict in others, so these norms do conflict sometimes. A robust norm of non-use might undercut the credibility of deterrent threats. For example, the ban treaty, which is promoting disarmament, challenges deterrence. So all of these, I would call them norms of nuclear restraint. They're different pathways to restraint in some form. They do reinforce each other sometimes, and sometimes they conflict with each other. Now let's take deterrence. I define here deterrence as a norm. And the reason is that I think stable deterrence and sort of the concept of stable deterrence, or an understanding of stable deterrence, it is something that was ultimately learned during the Cold War. So the US and the Soviet Union, right? There was a period in the 1950s that's sort of the balance of terror. And starting in the 1960s with arms control, both sides basically came to accept that nuclear weapons were not for warfighting, they were for deterrence, right? That the appropriate role for nuclear weapons was deterrence, not use. And that understanding was built into and reflected implicitly in a number of arms control and security cooperation agreements. The most important of these was the ABM Treaty. So the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, its regulative effect was to ban missile defenses of a certain kind, but its constitutive effect, right, the implicit, indirect effect of that was to, it was essentially a no strategic first use norm, right, because it basically said each side is going to leave itself vulnerable. And therefore, the only way you can do that is you have an understanding that nobody's intending to use nuclear weapons first. My view is that the beginning of the problems we face today is in part a result of the U.S. withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2002. So the Bush administration withdrew from a very important understanding about nuclear restraint with nothing to put in its place. And this has led to a sort of ongoing conflict between the U.S. and Russia over missile defenses, right? There's no shared understanding about what the role of missile defense is today. So deterrence today, I think, is under challenge from three areas: technological, political, and ethical. The technological challenge is that deterrence is now, it's now becoming, that the practice of deterrence is entangling nuclear and conventional weapons, right? So you have high-tech conventional weapons being targeted at, potentially targeted at nuclear weapons, right? A lot of dual use, the increasing number of dual use capabilities, right? The fire break between nuclear and conventional is no longer very clear. And so this poses a technological challenge to escalation and understandings of strategic stability. And there are no strategic stability dialogues going on today, and so countries are not renewing and reestablishing their understanding of what strategic stability means in an era when you have this entangling of nuclear and conventional weapons. The second challenge to deterrence is a political challenge, and this is the view coming from, especially on the right, that some countries simply can't be deterred. So this was a view of Iran, right? If Iran acquired a nuclear weapon, it was not rational, it would not be deterred. This is a view of North Korea as well. And so if there are some countries who are irrational and can't be deterred, then the option is not deterrence, but preventive war, preemptive war. So that's the political critique of deterrence. And then finally is the ethical critique of deterrence. And that comes from the humanitarian campaign and the Ban Treaty and Pope Francis, right? The argument that the threat to kill millions of people is fundamentally immoral. A deterrent threat is fundamentally immoral. And using nuclear weapons would be fundamentally immoral, and even the threat to do so would be immoral. And this is what's driven the Ban Treaty. The Ban Treaty is a disarmament treaty, but it also prohibits deterrence as well. So deterrence is under siege from these three areas. And I think the nuclear powers show a real lack of creativity or imagination in thinking about their nuclear relationships in this new era. And it's not just the US and Russia, but it's India and Pakistan, China as well, and of course, North Korea. All right, that's the deterrence norm. The non-proliferation norm, I think the norm itself is strong. Right? I think there's widespread support for the non-proliferation norm in the international community. The regime itself is suffering. It's under pressure. So partly because of the fissures created by the Ban Treaty and the advocates of the Ban Treaty, so there's a real confrontational politics, potentially very confrontational politics in the NPT review conferences. But there are also countries who are free riding on the regime. So India, Pakistan, and Israel free ride on the regime. They are free to expand their arsenals while benefiting from the norms that prevent others from joining the nuclear club. The NPT is a regime of double standards. It was supposed to be a transformation regime. That is, it was supposed to help the international community transform, move to a nuclear-free world. Instead, it has become a status quo regime, and the non-nuclear states perceive that basically it's a status quo regime that manages the nuclear order for the benefits of the nuclear powers. And that is unsustainable over the long haul. that is simply unsustainable. I don't think that the states are gonna run for the door on the NPT, but it will cease, it will decline in its role as a forum for reaching mutually beneficial agreements, right? So you'll get NPT review conferences that won't produce anything. You'll get, states who are unwilling to sign on to the additional protocol because they don't feel like doing anything more because the nuclear powers are not pursuing their obligation to disarm. Okay, the Nonuse Norm. All right, so this is a pretty important norm that I think is quite under pressure today. So we have doctrines from several states, doctrines that lower the threshold for use. We have new pursuit of low-yield nuclear weapons, and we have a lot of bellicose rhetoric. And all these things put pressure on the norm. So I think there's a general perception that the rules about nuclear use are being lowered, that the realm, that the options for using nuclear weapons are being expanded. So instead of continuing the trend of the Obama administration, where the goal was to roll back, to minimize the scenarios in which nuclear weapons would be used, once again there's an expansion. And I think this is not just the United States, I think potentially Russia, Pakistan as well. So this is, I think the Trump rhetoric has been incredibly damaging here. Sort of casually threatening nuclear weapons, talking as if they're usable, and making them seem both legitimate and useful. And this sends a big signal to everybody else. Well, if the United States thinks these are so important to have, we ought to get them too. Okay, the disarmament norm. So this is deeply contested. There's a vast disconnect between the rhetoric at the UN about disarmament and the reality of what nuclear states are doing domestically. And although the Obama administration put this on the agenda in a big way, the Trump administration is clearly rolling back on disarmament. Trump officials, it's not even mentioned in the nuclear posture review. Trump officials don't sort of restate their obligation under the NPT to pursue disarmament. So this is a real ratcheting backwards here. The ban treaty is, of course, an attempt to step forward on disarmament. This is driven by the non-nuclear states' frustration with the lack of progress on disarmament. I actually think it's more useful to think about the ban treaty as a stigmatization treaty. So disarmament is not going to happen tomorrow under the ban treaty, and the advocates of the ban treaty know this. They are not expecting disarmament to happen anytime soon. It's really about stigmatization. It's about strengthening the norm of non-use, the nuclear taboo, creating a new focal point for action for domestic politics, putting pressure on the European democracies, the European allies, who are going to feel this pressure the most. So while it's I think it's an effort to strengthen the nuclear taboo, and I think an important effort. It could also be it does have some risks in the sense of it could, and you see some of this already, it provokes the nuclear states, instead of engaging in the discourse of stigmatization and taboo, the nuclear states restate more vociferously why they need nuclear weapons, why nuclear weapons are valuable, and why they need to keep them. So, and it potentially, though, it may give rise to quite divisive politics in the NPT. Okay, arms control. I think I'm going to leave most of this to my colleagues. Arms control once played a very central role in codifying shared understandings about deterrence, and now arms control is really, the future of treaty-based arms control is really, really open to question. I assume we're going to be talking about this today. I do state here some norms that have gone by the wayside. And it's useful to point out some opposing norms that pose a challenge. So norms that associate nuclear weapons with great power status, with prestige, and with notions of exceptionalism, right? There are countries who kind of deserve to have nuclear weapons because they're exceptional in some way. All right, so looking ahead, what norms do we want? How do we renew a regime of nuclear restraint? I think our primary goal is to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, prevent any use of nuclear weapons, and to strengthen norms of nuclear restraint. These, to me, seem like a pretty good set of norms. And so I think one of the things we want to think about is how do we revive these norms? How do we renew a commitment to these norms? There are a number of ways we can do that, and I think we'll be talking about that today. I'll just state one thing I think we could do here, which is to talk about them. So one of the single most important things that leaders could do is to stand up and say, nuclear weapons haven't been used in 73 years, and we hope they will never be used again. This tradition of non-use is important. We hope never to have to use nuclear weapons. It is our fervent goal that we won't use these. We are going to take steps not to use them. That is, in the situation we are in today, just talking about norms like that, if leaders got together, if Indian and Pakistani leaders got together, US and Russian leaders got together and made public statements, that was the single most important thing we could do right now to move ourselves out of this, I think, downward slide, this unraveling of norms that we're facing now. And beyond this public talk, then there's a number of other things we could do. These are all sort of out in the public square, moving toward no first use policies, talking about what contributes to strategic stability today, talking about ethical aspects of deterrence. These are a number of things we could do. But I think for now, just starting to talk about publicly about the value of these norms would be an important first step. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. You know, it belatedly occurs to me that for people live streaming this and people who come on board later to watch this, I ought to actually say that the name of your book, Nina Tannenwald, is The Nuclear Taboo, and that you teach it Brown. And that Lynn, our next speaker, Lynn Rustin, is a vice president at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and she has worked on Capitol Hill, staff, Senate Armed Services Committee, has worked in the executive branch, NSC staff, National Security Council staff, State Department. So she brings multiple interesting insider looks into this, as does Jon Wolfsthal, who is a director of the Nuclear Crisis Group, works at Global Zero, and he has worked in the inside during the Obama administration, having very close looks as a National Security Council staffer, and working for the vice president as well. So Lynn, you're up next.
Well, actually, maybe I won't bring my water. It's not a flat surface,
It's
okay?
not gonna, yeah.
Okay. Hi. So thank you. That was very interesting, Nina. When I worked in the Senate, I worked for a lovely senator who used to say very clever things. And one of the things he always said about the Senate was, everything has been said, but not everyone has said it yet. And when they're presiding on the floor. So to some extent, I may be saying some similar things to Nina, but from a very different perspective of a practitioner. And as Michael said, I spent a lot of time working these issues in government and a lot on nuclear arms control, including on the original START delegation in Geneva in 1991. And I was there for Endgame and subsequent New START and other treaties in between. So I want to kind of step back a little bit and just kind of paint the picture of where I think we are, which is relevant to norms and treaties. I think we're at a really dangerous time right now where the risk of and potential for nuclear use is probably as high as it's been since the Cold War. And at the same time, our leaders and the American people are incredibly complacent about this. And that's a dangerous combination. There's, as Nina said, there's an incredible absence of constructive dialogue between the United States and Russia on nuclear matters, and that lack of dialogue is an accelerant to the situation I just described. There's plenty of blame to go around. Certainly from the US perspective, there's Russian, I'll just call it bad behavior, starting with Ukraine in 2014, not just starting, but Ukraine in 2014, and subsequently election meddling, INF violation, and there's a litany, and I'm sure Russia could recite a similar litany about us. In terms of the West, though, from my perspective, the no business as usual policy in terms of reduced engagement and dialogue with Russia has definitely outlived its utility as a policy, as an effective policy tool, especially in the nuclear realm. And we've now devolved to a situation where diplomacy is considered a reward for good behavior rather than as a tool. And so we're kind of robbing ourselves of the tools we need to change the trajectory that we're on right now, which is a very dangerous one. And then we have Congress and the domestic political situation we're in right now, where there's tremendous distrust of our president, and in particular our president's approach to Russia. There's a Mueller investigation. There are legislative restrictions on mill-to-mill dialogue and other forms of dialogue. And so we're in an environment where there just isn't political space to be having the kind of dialogue that our countries need to have, that we need to have at, not just at the most senior level, but really throughout various levels of government and military and diplomatic channels. On top of that, from my reading of the administration's key strategy documents, the Nuclear Posture Review, National Security Strategy, they're focused very much on a return to great power competition, China and Russia in particular, of course, and talk about that both as a rationale for the, policies and force structures that we're pursuing as a country, and also a driver, a driver of threat. And there's really short shrift in those documents to what the other whole of government tools are to mitigate threats, including arms control and diplomacy. And so we're 2 years into this administration, and I, for one, don't really know what the positive, strategy or agenda is to deal with these issues through other than, military means. I'm sure we'll get into INF, but I'll just as an example, in terms of INF, I think the messaging on what we're doing and why is really unclear. I mean, there's been insufficient coordination with allies, it appears, from the outside, little consultation with Congress, and very mixed messages as to whether our aim is, in fact, was trying to, return Russia to compliance and actually preserve the treaty, or whether, in fact, now the United States believes it's just in our interest to be free of the constraints, not just as a response to Russia's violation, but because we actually have military requirements for this range of systems. So it's been confused, to say the least. In terms of New START, I certainly believe that the treaty's in our mutual interest, ours and Russia's, and that it ought to be extended. There are things, now I'm kind of turning to things we can do, both normative and treaty-based. There's certainly things we could do if it were extended. On top of that, if the Trump administration wanted to put its own mark in the nuclear arms control realm in terms of reductions or clarifying how the treaty would apply to new kinds of strategic systems. You could even do that in a Moscow Treaty sort of way on top, overlaid on top of an extended treaty, which would then provide verification, predictability, and all the benefits that the treaty provides. Instead, however, I fear that we're headed toward an era of deregulation in nuclear systems. On top of that, as Nina said, we've got new technologies to be concerned about, and we too are mostly, and I say we, I sort of, NTI corporately, is very focused on reducing the risks of nuclear use above all, and treaties are important to that, but they're not even necessarily the most important. So we're very focused, for instance, on the cyber risk to nuclear weapons, command and control systems, and the origin of those threats could be a multitude of actors, including actors that don't even have nuclear weapons. And that could perturb, it does perturb that risk, the stability of deterrence, even if you think deterrence is stable and working, because it just raises the risks of a false warning, of command and control not being executed through the system, of systems not working when they're supposed to or working when they're not supposed to. So it's really a huge risk, and we're really not talking about it, and we're certainly doing, there's limits to what certainly the Pentagon and the NPR was very focused on, resilience in this area, as it should be, and that's certainly part of the solution, but it's not 100% fail-safe solution, and so there really needs to be, if there were a reinvigorated dialogue with Russia, this is one of the things that should be on the agenda, although granted, it's very sensitive and very, very difficult, but just to even come to some mutual awareness of what the cyber risks are in the nuclear realm, and starting to think about, nor this is an area in my view for norms, not treaties, but to start to even think about that. Other things that we should be doing and thinking about are force posture, reducing forces on prompt alert, focusing on survivable forces and reducing incentives to strike first. And this is again in the cyber risk era. These ideas, although they seem more and more remote as subjects between our countries, they're all the more important. In the Euro-Atlantic, there are things we could be doing, even if the INF Treaty, and maybe especially if ultimately the INF Treaty expires, as it looks like it's going to, we ought to be thinking about, that treaty in part was about increasing decision and warning time, right? It was about not having nuclear forces, within short flying times of each other's targets. And we ought to be thinking about other ways of reducing the risk, especially the nuclear ones. And so you could look at regimes, be they treaty-based or otherwise, that involved not storing nuclear warheads at bases where the delivery systems are deployed, that kind of thing. And then more fundamentally, I'm just kind of going through a random list, but as Nina said, there really needs to be more fundamental conversation right now about doctrines. Clearly, there are concerns and different views about what Russia's doctrine really is, and similarly, I think there are questions about ours, and there needs to be more discussion between our sides to kind of explain each other's doctrines and how the doctrines match up with the force postures, and what are the risks for use and miscalculation. And then I'll wrap up in a minute. I agree, the lack of kind of the deteriorating situation and the erosion of arms control architecture that we're witnessing right now all redounds really unfavorably to the NPT context, for all the reasons that Nina just said, so I won't rehearse them, but the divisions between the nuclear haves and the have-nots are growing, and it's creating a real strain on the NPT, and that's something we should all be concerned about. There really needs to be a renewed demonstration of not just U.S.-Russia, but really P5 commitment toward their Article 6 commitment to continue the reductions process. So even though I'm pessimistic in the short term, in the long term, I believe there will be some kind of return to mutual regulation and norms, because I think it's clearly in our interest and Russia's interest. You know, we've had it for over 50 years, and I don't think we're at a point yet clearly where we're prepared to. I mean, I think will be a recognition that there really isn't unilateral advantage to be gained, and that both sides benefit by the mutual regulation. But I worry about how things are going to get back, how things are going to get bad before we get back to that. And I'll just conclude and say, by coincidence, Bill Perry was in our office today. He's amazing, and he's still incredibly active and committed to these issues. And as I'm sure many of you have heard him say before, I mean, we were more lucky than right in terms of how we managed to survive the Cold War without any nuclear use. And now, just speaking for myself, I think luck and complacency are not a strategy, and we really need to wake ourselves up so that we don't sleepwalk into a very serious conflict. That's it.
Thank you, Ruth. Go on up here, guy.
I can't sit from here?
Well, you can do it from there.
Does anybody mind? Heather's going to be okay for that. So thank you, Michael and Stimson, for having me and us and holding this discussion. As bad as Nina and Lynn make it sound, let me assure you, it's actually much worse than that. I'm less diplomatic and less academically accomplished than the rest of my panelists. But we're not even on autopilot, right? I mean, there's a very minimal veneer of control over the nuclear landscape today in the United States and among the global powers that possess nuclear weapons. And you've heard this talked about in different ways: complacency, all too willing to make nuclear threats, making them more part of the nuclear fabric. And there's a cost to that. And on top of that, in the American system, you can't divorce what's going on in the presidency and in the White House from the way we're seen internationally and the way nuclear materials and nuclear weapons are controlled. And you don't have to go very far on Capitol Hill and talk to people and ask, like, why aren't senators more concerned about this? So don't worry, Mattis is up here telling us that Stratcom doesn't make a pot of coffee without him knowing about it. He's inserted himself into the chain of command. For those of you that don't track this stuff, the Secretary of Defense is not in the nuclear use chain of command. So we have extra legal activities in place to try to placate the body politic in the United States in a way that is undemocratic, and that gives me no sense of confidence that should there be a crisis, an accident, a training event, that things could not go sideways very quickly. And that's where I think, as Lynn said, luck and complacency are no way to bank on survival. So Michael asked us to come and talk about sort of what happens when arms control fails or what happens after arms control. And I'll talk about it largely in the bilateral nuclear arms control deterrent relationship, but I think we should be thinking about also non-proliferation bargains, both bilateral deals. We didn't call the agreed framework with North Korea arms control, but essentially that's what it was. We tried to buy them out, or the JCPOA is a form of arms control. But in the old days, like when Michael was working instead of opining, right? Arms control was not a means to an end. Or sorry, arms control was a means to an end. It wasn't an end in itself, right? It was a way to achieve your national security objectives through diplomatic means. And at a certain point, all of these fields sort of merged. Deterrence theory and nuclear deterrent gurus and arms controllers and non-proliferation experts all sort of became the arms control community. And it's sort of like a black hole. It sort of has this gravitational pull, and it pulls all things to it, like nuclear security is part of arms control, even though they try to break away, because they don't want to be associated with those arms controllers. And I think increasingly we're going to have to think about arms control in that sense, right? New START was done because we wanted to keep arms control going. We wanted the transparency and predictability of arms control. But even we did not claim New START was a major advance in disarmament or a major advance in channeling nuclear competition, right? We thought we were going to get a second bite at the arms control apple because the Bush administration had left this like a ticking diplomatic nightmare on our doorstep. The best case is that the Trump administration leaves the expiration of New START as a ticking diplomatic nightmare for the next administration. Actually, the best case is they negotiate a sort of veneer agreement like Treaty of Moscow on top of New START extension, but they're not going to do that. I think they're likely to either leave it to expire February 5th, or they'll enact withdrawal and not give the next administration a chance to actually keep it alive. If that's the case, then I think we have to really be thinking hard now about what is it that arms control gives us that we value and that we want to achieve. What do we want to get out of the management of nuclear affairs? And I put that into three categories in the near term, right? Long-term objectives, I think the United States remain the same. It's not, as much as I admire the credit that Lynn and I get for Obama putting disarmament on the agenda, this has been American legal nuclear policy since the Baruch, well, it's stated policy since the Baruch Plan, legal obligation arguably since the 1970 NPT. President Obama recast it as an important part of our sort of forward-leaning strategy. But in the near term, I look at three categories. How do we achieve strategic stability? How do we enhance crisis stability? And how do we achieve arms race stability? And we could talk about each of those and what they mean, but arms control throughout history, whether it's the ABM Treaty or START or INF, we're about achieving those things. How do you ensure a situation where both sides agree, yeah, we're good. We're either mutually vulnerable or we have enough and we're confident in our retaliatory capability that we don't need to go first. We don't need to use nuclear weapons first. Or in a crisis, if we see something we don't understand, we don't have to hit the button first and ask questions later. That's what INF was all about. And arms race stability, again, we are in an arms race, even though part of our own government doesn't want to acknowledge or admit that. How do we get to a situation where everything we do doesn't drive a Russian reaction, and how everything Russia does doesn't drive an American reaction, right? We should have what we need, but we shouldn't just react. And I think that's true when we expand the lens to China as well. I've yet to see the argument for why we need land-based INF systems because China has them, right? That doesn't strike me as a strategy. That strikes me as a reflex. And so I want to see that thinking. So for me, that when we talk about whether we're going to get back into arms control, it's through that lens. What's the objective we're trying to achieve? And deterrence will be part of that. Alliance management will be part of that. Arms control may be part of that. Unilateral action may be part of that. Parallel unilateral understandings may be part of that. And I think Lynn is spot on that having read through all these documents and knowing people working these issues, we don't have a broader strategy. We have a nuclear policy which says we need a bunch more nuclear weapons, including low yield and probably slick them, and we'll use them if we have to. But I don't know how that integrates into alliance management. This president doesn't really care about alliances. I don't know how it works into other facets of American global leadership. This administration doesn't really believe in American global leadership. It believes in nationalism. Right? What was the Pompeo speech? We're going to re-inject nationalism into our multilateral global affairs. The two are not compatible, right? Let's assume New START goes away, INF goes away, we're left in an era where the United States and Russia don't have these nuclear guardrails in place. What happens? Well, there's a horrible set of nightmare scenarios that we could paint for you. The one I worry about is the worst case decision making. It's how we get the bomber gap and the missile gap. And without the transparency and predictability that comes from arms control, And for those geeks in the room, the real sort of, insiders, the priority we put on our intelligence community in order to monitor arms control compliance, if that goes away, in the public debate, we will have, oh my God, the Russians have A, B, and Z, and we have to surge ahead. And then that arms race stability question really becomes front and center. Look, mind your history, the Team B report, all these other incidents where we were convinced the Russians had huge advantages over us because we didn't have not just the declarations and the transparency, but because in the intelligence community, top-level priorities for where they invest their dollars on development of technology, satellites, intelligence analysts, arms control is at the top. Now, could this administration say, well, let's get rid of arms control, but we'll rewrite the intelligence priorities? Maybe, but I don't think these guys can make a tuna fish sandwich. So I don't think they really have the nuts and bolts understanding for how to implement from top order priority all the way down through the chain. And so I worry a lot that you will end up with this gap in our prioritization, let alone the demonization of the intelligence community and the manipulation of truth. So I worry a lot that we will just end up needing a lot more in the nuclear realm, and that will drive a cycle of both nuclear modernization, which is how we got to arsenals of 30, 35,000 nuclear weapons during the Cold War, each. That's nonsensical. Then, of course, there's even the worst scenario, which is in this environment where both sides are arms racing, we're not talking to each other. I could get a robust debate started right now about whether Russia has or does not have an escalate to de-escalate strategy, whether this president would use nuclear weapons without premeditation. So imagine what it's like if you actually have responsibility over managing nuclear affairs and you see something on your radar screen that doesn't look right. The risk of escalation remains exceedingly high. And the Nuclear Crisis Group at Global Zero is focused in on what are the incidents that happen every day that could lead to escalation, what is our ability to manage and communicate in a crisis. We're fortunate, I guess you could call it, that General Dunford talks to his counterpart, General Gerasimov, because of Syria, because that's such a mess, that he could pick up the phone and say, General, look, we have a problem here. It looks like this is happening. What's actually happening? But when Dunford goes away, that relationship won't exist. We don't have these relationships at the lower level, and those relationships matter if you're trying to turn off a nuclear crisis. Putin and Trump clearly can't have that conversation, because who would believe it? I don't know how we turn off, as much as I love the nuclear risk reduction centers and the communication links, we're no longer going to fall back on a chain of computer code to trust that, Putin hasn't launched. Right, so how do we turn those things off? So those pair of things only get worse in a world without arms control. Now, they could get worse even with arms control, but there are bigger problems if you don't have at least these basic understandings. And as Nina said, you don't have the doctrinal conversations going on. What really is your doctrine? We see these developments. How does that fit in? Just to understand what's going on. Now, there's also the flip side of this, which is maybe there's a silver lining to formalized arms control going away. I was talking to Michael before. I'm sort of a cynic on this. As much as I work with Global Zero and believe that the public needs to be engaged on these issues, if you get a small group of people in the right positions in government, you can do tremendous things when it comes to the nuclear complex, and you can change direction quite rapidly. And if Donald Trump has shown us anything, it's the true nature of executive power. The president can overrule his Secretary of Defense, his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his vice chairman, his commander of Strategic Command. And if you have a president who decides, you know what, I only want 1,000 weapons and I only want to spend $10 billion a year on it because that's my priority, that can happen. And in a world where you don't have arms control, and where Democrats and Republicans don't believe that there's a consensus around funding a certain type of nuclear arsenal, if all that breaks down, in some ways there is greater flexibility for a future president, Republican or Democrat. So I don't prefer that world. I prefer a world where we can be more stable and predictable and sustainable. I think that's better for the U.S.-Russian relationship. I think that's better for the U.S.-China relationship. But if we're going to strip off the gloves and we're going to get down to bare-knuckle politics when it comes to managing nuclear affairs, if the people who believe that nuclear weapons are great are in charge and they're going to push ahead, the people who believe that nuclear weapons have costs may also get in those positions of power, and they may change direction. And that's just something we have to be thinking through. And for me, and I'll make a couple more points and then I'll stop. Conceptually, these groups, if you take out the partisan politics for a minute, I think people who work on nuclear issues generally break down into two groups. And I think, with a few exceptions, we're pretty well unified on the basic principles that nobody wants to see nuclear weapons used. Right? Some people believe you have to threaten to use them in order to prevent them from being used, but most sane people don't want nuclear weapons to go off. There are a few exceptions to that. But then you have two camps. There are people who believe that nuclear weapons, maintaining them in large numbers, threatening their use, is okay because nuclear weapons are generally cost and risk-free. Or they're very minimal. They downplay the cost and risks associated with nuclear weapons. We can manage them. We've managed them for 70 plus years. It's a small portion of the budget. You've heard all these arguments, and they're coming out of the Trump administration. And then you have the counterpoint, which are people who think that, well, actually, we underplay the risks and costs of nuclear weapons. They're much more expensive than people appreciate. There are events every day that could lead to their use. And ask people how they view nuclear weapons, and I think you'll find they fall pretty neatly into those two camps. And so again, as you look at the future of arms control, who's going into these positions that will decide whether we should or shouldn't negotiate future agreements, I think generally the people that think the risks are higher will be willing to look at arms control and invest the time and effort to work out those deals, because they are complex. They're arcane. Don't yell at me. They're boring. In some ways, right? Building nuclear weapons and launching submarines and testing weapons, much more compelling than sitting in a room in Geneva and negotiating arms control agreements and the legalese around how many Type A and Type B inspections do you get. But you'll see that people are willing to invest their time and effort in different parts. So where do we go from here? I think we've got three possible futures. One is we lose arms control. We go to the mattresses when it comes to nuclear arms racing with the Russians and the Chinese, and we end up 10, 20 years from now with a whole lot of nuclear weapons, a lot of money spent on these systems, and a really questionable grasp on stability. And we sort of go day by day. The people who are arguing for nuclear competition now, I've not heard any of them explain what the end game is. Except for a few people who think, well, we outspent the Soviet Union, we'll outspend Putin on this stuff. I don't think that's right. I don't see how we get from here to there. I think we just end up keep spending and spiraling. The second is we get a different president who says, screw this, we're going to go back to Bush 2, and we're just going to determine what we need, and we're going to maintain that. And as long as the Russians don't build 50,000 nuclear weapons, and we maintain some rough semblance of parity, we're good. 1,000, 500, 1,500, pick your number, but we're not going down that bilateral negotiated process. I think you could get that from a Republican or a Democrat, quite frankly. I think you're more likely to get it from a Republican. They have more latitude, but I think it remains to be seen. And then where I think we should go is, quite frankly, where the Russians have been talking about going for some time, which is we propose going to a new lower level after new start of about 1,000 nuclear weapons. And Putin came back and said, we don't want to just talk nuclear anymore. That doesn't make sense to us. We want to talk defenses. We want to talk conventional. We want to talk new technologies and hyperglides. And we said, oh, we don't have a willing partner, and they're just obfuscating, and they're trying to make it overly complicated. But if you take a step back and say, well, missile defenses and offenses do have a relationship. Republicans can deny it all they want. There's an interrelationship between these things. We should be talking about them. Doesn't mean they have to be in an arms control agreement, but we should be sitting down and talking about how these things interplay off of each other. Hyperglide, it's a niche capability. Nobody in the United States thinks we're going to build thousands of these things. How do they factor in? Close in, I think we have to start talking about now INF systems, if these are going to be deployed. How do they factor into that? Conventional deployments, those have to be part of the conversation. By broadening the aperture to include what's necessary for stability, what threats do we see coming from Russia, what threats do they see coming from us, from that we can have a conversation about what can we control and what do we just have to agree to disagree on. And I'm actually optimistic we might actually get there. I don't think it's that hard. I think the Russians will want to be in that sort of dialogue with us. We have to get over a lot of big hurdles first, including current president and the controversy over Russia's interference and managing how we think broadly about our relationship with Russia. But I think if we can work that out politically and strategically, then it's a natural turn to think about managing that competition. So sorry for going on a little long.
That's great. Exactly what the doctor ordered. Please put your microphones on if you haven't already, and gather your materials. I have two thoughts before opening it up to questions or comments. What do Robert Redford and Donald Trump have in common? Strangely, this thought occurred to me as I was listening. They both won elections and then asked, okay, what do we do now? Now, I'm dating myself. Robert Redford was in a movie called The Candidate. And I recommend it to anyone who hasn't heard of it or seen it. What do we do now? My takeaway from listening to you, and thank you very much, I'm thinking now in terms of a prevent, promote, and reduce strategy. Prevent use, promote restraint, reduce nuclear dangers and weapons. Too big for a bumper sticker? Very unwieldy as a replacement for nuclear arms control. But now I'm toying with this. So thank you very much. All right, the floor is open. Please tell us who you are. Please don't go on and on and on. Who wants to go first? My God, we've answered every question.
I'll ask a stupid question, but it seems that Milton Honig, it seems that in a popular way, we hear the phrase escalate to de-escalate. John mentioned it. And, you know, what is it? It's taken to sort of summarize everything, seems to me. It's a dangerous phrase, mainly. I wish you'd talk about that a bit. What is it really, when people hear the phrase escalate to de-escalate, what do they think? What goes through their mind?
That's a great question. Thank you, Milton.
Inside the U.S. government, the people that work on this and who try to game and exercise against it believe it means in a conventional conflict, which the Russians are losing, and Putin feels that there is either a threat to him politically or a threat to the Russian state's existence, that he would use nuclear weapons first to tell the United States and NATO, stop, to stalemate the conflict. And so he tried to get out of a failed conflict by making it more costly and then suing for peace or a truce. And basically, there are lots of different ways of talking about it. It's not that different from our strategy where we say we're willing to use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. And it's not that different from the idea that you can control escalation. That we would show that we care about this more, we bump up by using a small yield nuclear weapon to show the Russians they can't get away with it. And then, of course, things would just die down. That's how I think it's seen in the U.S. government. Lynn, is that consistent with your understanding and how
Yeah,
people talk about it?
It's the idea of the
Yeah.
early use of a small weapon. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's debated whether that's actually the Russian doctrine.
Right, right.
but-
I
Can
mean,
you
I think
talk about
yeah.
that piece, Lynn? Is this real? Is this fantasy?
Phantasmagorical.
Well,
Phantasmagorical?
there are others who are more expert on this than I, like Olga Oliker has
Yeah.
written extensively on this, but
And Nina, and,
about whether it's official doctrine or not.
and
there's-
Kristen
Kristen Van Bruskar,
just has a piece this week that's not bad on it.
So can I?
please.
So I don't have an independent expert opinion on the Russian doctrine. I mean, the experts on this don't agree with each other, right? About whether Russia really has this doctrine, and Russia denies that it does. What's important, though, here, I think, is that, to the extent that this doctrine exists, it's perceived as lowering the threshold for use of nuclear weapons, that it involves a step backward from sort of where we'd come, because it's a doctrine that involves an early use of a low-yield nuclear weapon. And so the charge from the Trump administration people is that Russia is lowering the threshold for nuclear use, and they've got this strategy to use a low-yield nuclear weapon in a conventional conflict early on. Now, I think what's ironic here is Trump people are charging Russia with lowering the nuclear threshold with this doctrine, but then saying, well, we have to match them. We need our own low-yield nuclear weapon. But in contrast, we are not lowering the threshold for nuclear use, right? That's you can't have it both ways, right? So I think that's one of the issues here.
Can I
sorry.
just, I mean, of course, this is not new. If you go back to the 1960s in reverse, when the Soviet Union had massive, conventional forces, and we were worried about them. Of course, we had a deterrence doctrine that was based on, threat of first use. What's really dangerous about all this, I think, is the kind of loose talk on both sides about the potential early in use of a low yield or small nuclear weapon, and the idea that the consequences aren't that different from conventional weapons, that it can be controlled. I mean, that's what's really dangerous. And I think the further that we as societies get from a time when a nuclear weapon was once used and people really understand these weapons and their consequences, I think the more and more abstract it becomes, and the less people really understand what the consequences are of these weapons being used, and that's dangerous.
Last point on this, Milton, because you could get us talking for a long time, is I think it's correct that there is a big debate among Russia experts whether this is in fact Russian doctrine or not. There is no debate inside the Pentagon and inside the military that this is Russian doctrine. And we assume it's true, we plan for it, and we exercise for it, and we game it. And so that's another example of how not communicating and having trust leads to worst case assumptions, and that can be dangerous.
I can't resist. Think about the fundamental assumption behind pursuing low-yield weapons. That fundamental presumption, as Lynn told us, and all of us have inferred, is that use and escalation can be controlled. So after mushroom clouds appear on a battlefield, first time since 1945, after two major powers have gotten things so wrong as to allow this to happen, we can get on the same page very quickly to stop escalation. That's one heck of an assumption. That's heroic. It's more than heroic. Hannah, please ask a question. And, oh, Deborah, please ask a question.
Thank you, Michael. Deborah Decker with the Stimson Center. I feel so old and so young here. I was in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. I remember when Paul Wolfowitz joined in the 70s. And the fundamental question is, what is strategic stability? We're no longer in a time where communism is going to, it's wanting to wipe out the United States as another ism. And so I think there's a larger question here, and I don't understand why today the U.S. and Russia is at such odds. And I've made overtures, and the Stimson Center has, to try to engage further with the Russians and understand some of the potential for cooperation, because I think that today it's very different. We do want the same thing. So I think that discussion here needs to be broadened, because what I work on here is nuclear security, WMD security, terrorism, cyber, and I don't see a war of aggression occurring, maybe India, Pakistan, but not among the major players. I see a war of erosion of democracy, of trust, investment, economy, IP theft from the Chinese, critical infrastructure. Homeland Security did a briefing on who's in our critical infrastructure. So can we talk a little bit about what is strategic stability and why a lot of what we're discussing here is U.S. and Russia, and a little bit of China?
Thanks. You remind me, Deborah, to prod Nina to think about adding a norm to your list. The norm is nuclear safety and security. This is something that I think the Obama administration deserves credit for, to try and raise these practices to the level of normative behavior. And this one's pretty important. It's our newest nuclear norm. But I digress. So strategic stability, that sounds kind of airy-fairy to me. What does it mean? What do we want here?
Well, I thought Jon had a good discussion of that, actually, in talking about arms race stability and crisis stability and strategic stability. I mean, they're different pieces of this.
Yeah, and this is part of the challenge. There's a debate in the United States about even what we mean by it. Traditionally, as you know well, and Michael and others here know well, it meant neither side is in a situation where it sees a need or pressure to use nuclear weapons first. That if that's the case, both sides have second strike retaliatory capabilities, and their national command authority feels that they can continue in a crisis, that then allows both sides to be in a more stable situation. I don't know anymore that that's the Russian definition, and I don't know anymore that that's the uniform American definition. I think that's part of the debate that we have to have here in the United States, and part of the discussion we have to have with Russia. I think that's a fine definition, and one that I'd like to get back to. But in a world where we are building missile defenses, in a world where the Russian interest and President Putin's interests are identical, because it is the state of Putin, is a less predictable one, right? I mean, I don't know how Vladimir Putin determines stability. He may view a more stable situation where things are destabilized. That's his action. That's what he is engaged in. And so, again, I think having this discussion, I do think it has to be broader than just the nuclear, and talk about national sovereignty and security, whether it's critical infrastructure or elections and democratization. I think that has to be part of the broader understandings. I think, quite frankly, this is an aside, the deterrent relationship we need to have with Vladimir Putin is much broader than nuclear deterrent. It's about deterring other actions that threaten us and our allies that have nothing to do with nuclear weapons, and for which threats of nuclear force are totally inappropriate and not useful. But we're not having that discussion again because of where we are.
To shift from Stimson to Stimson, I'm going to let Hans ask a question.
Hans Christensen, Federation of American Scientists. So a lot of the conversation, of course, is about U.S.-Russia, because it's what dominates it. But when we're talking about norms and NPT and all these broader issues, the challenge, of course, is also in that situation, what are the kind of conversations and interactions that we need to have in order to engage other lower-tier nuclear weapon states, so to speak, to join the conversation on a more practical level, real things they can do, even in this picture of the United States and Russia being very sour at each other these days. I'm asking this not just because, wouldn't it be great to get more countries in, but also because it could be that there is a way that the United States and Russia could actually see a joint interest in trying to engage countries that are lower on the totem pole. What are some of those scenarios,
I mean,
conversations?
I think that's absolutely true, and by the way, it's the official position of Russia, as I understand it, in terms of further reductions, that, whereas I think the United States feels like there's space for, well, at least the previous administration, that there's space for, another round of bilateral reductions before you could realistically bring in the other declared nuclear powers, that Russia took the position that it was time to do it, in the next phase. So that's one area. I think totally separately, the cyber issues I raised, I mean, those are relevant to every country with nuclear weapons, and that's a kind of conversation that we should be having again. I mean, I'd see it maybe starting out with a bilateral discussion in terms of, understanding the problem and talking about norms, and then broadening that. In the NPT context, of course, there's a need to do more, do something on the P5 level.
Yeah.
But I think one way to bring in the other countries, is the CTBT, right? That's the big, where there should be a big push to bring countries in, right? India, Pakistan, China.
Or the FMCT.
Or the FMCT, yeah.
So,
But even just discussing doctrines and force posture and that kind of thing.
yeah, so I have a slightly different take on this just because of the work we're doing on Nuclear Crisis Group, which is all states should have an interest in avoiding the use of nuclear weapons, whether you have a lot or a small number of them. And so what are the steps that are useful in preventing nuclear weapons from being used accidentally or early in a crisis? And so those are regional and global efforts that have to be made. Some of those are basic good practices, incidents at sea agreements, communication links, things that help the United States and Russia develop a relationship that then turned into an arms control relationship and a deterrent relationship. But in some cases, there are going to be mismatches. And so things in South Asia relate to non-deployment in the field. In the case of the U.S. and China, are there incidents avoidance agreements that have to be negotiated? To me, I think we have to get down into the nuts and bolts of those countries, maybe even before we get to doctrinal conversations and get to restraint agreements, because the risk that an incident on a glacier or at sea or in air is going to lead to something really bad is with us now, and I don't think we can wait for the political system to catch up.
In my dream state, I think about a norm of no increases in nuclear weapon deployments, which is everybody. Everybody. Modernization, okay, we get it. But no additional numbers deployed. To me, again in this dream state, the one country where this shoe would rub the most is probably China.
The MIRVs.
Yeah. I mean, India, Pakistan, they could live with their numbers. We and the Russians certainly could live with our numbers. North Korea, this would be interesting. It's worth noodling around. Yes, sir, and then Hannah, I promise.
Thank you. My name is Michiru Nishida from the Embassy of Japan. Thank you very much for all the panelists for the very insightful presentations, and especially I really like the structure of the norms by Dr. Tannenwald. And my question is about the norm of transparency. You put the norm of transparency in a procedural norm. But in a world where arms control treaties may be thrashed, which is the topic of this seminar, perhaps transparency may play a sort of a replacement role of arms control treaties. And in relation to the norms that Michael was saying, like prevention of use, and also you were saying about that, but promoting restraint. All these were sort of addressed by arms control treaties, which was addressing strategic stability, like as Jon was saying. So, but actually, transparency was a core part of arms control treaties, and so if treaties are not possible, then transparency could play a bigger role. In that case, maybe do you think transparency norm could be sort of raised to the level of a substantive norm rather than just a procedural norm?
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting question. Perhaps it may have to play a more important role in the absence of arms control. I mean, it doesn't require arms control. So you have the P5 who are supposed to be reporting on their disarmament efforts and their force structures in the context of the NPT. They're doing a terrible job. But the whole goal of that was to create more transparency about what the P5 are doing in terms of their obligations under the NPT. The United States has actually been the best on that front in what is an overall a really, I think, a dissatisfying effort. I mean, but that's an example of transparency as kind of not any part of arms control, but just part of a kind of political agreement, right, to demonstrate progress on the NPT. So I do think transparency is central because it's part of threat reduction, it's part of creating predictability, it's part of basically creating sort of estimates of sort of creating knowledge about what the nature of the threat is. So I mean that would be one direction to go in, is to emphasize transparency, to make greater commitments to it in various contexts, even in the absence of an arms control agreement. I think that's a good suggestion.
Well, it can offer, the kind of predictability and planning assumptions if you're being transparent about your forces, or we, for instance, offered, a transparency regime on missile defense to the Russians in the last administration, but they, were only interested in legally binding agreements. But actually, you can actually help provide some, a considerable amount of information and some predictability so that the other side knows what to expect and can plan accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key, that it provides predictability. And, it's an interesting question. When we launched into arms control in the 1960s and 70s, there were limits to what we could do because we didn't have on-site inspections. So we relied on national technical means, and that's why you had limitation agreements, right? You shall have no more than, because Russia would Soviet Union would test a missile. Telemetry, which was non-encrypted, would say, okay, it has 8 warheads, therefore all missiles of that type have 8 warheads, and we look for those missiles. And then we had on-site inspection, which allowed us to do more nuanced things. Be interesting to test the case that I know IPNDV, that NTI is very deeply involved in, and our friends at Monterey who scour the earth, minute by minute and reveal things as they happen. Could we get greater confidence in a declaration from a country based on just what's available open source? I think the answer is yes. We would have more ability to verify independently without arms control agreements if those declarations were routine, forward-looking, for the next year we will only have X. The problem is that same transparency regime that we would rely on also produces false positives. And that's how you get people say, well, if you look at the tunnels in China, they have at least 3,000 nuclear weapons, right? So you have to be careful about relying purely on that unilateral transparency or monitoring. There has to be some cooperative component, I would argue, for the United States military and political system to bank on it. Otherwise, we still then fall into more worst-case pressure decision-making.
Michiru, we thank you for being a regular here, and we appreciate the government of Japan's interest in this work. Hannah?
Hannah Hagelin at the Stimson Center, and my question
Does everybody here work at the Stimson Center?
We're a powerhouse for nuclear policy. My question is, in a world where we seem to have a lowering threshold for nuclear use, what role can new research on the effects of nuclear use play? And among the different kinds of effects a policymaker might think about in terms of economic or social or strategic and military or political, what are the key trade-offs that new research could play out when we think about Michael's comments on how the fundamental assumption under these increasingly smaller warheads is that we can limit escalation to just one or two?
Why don't you go first, Nina?
Well, so the ban campaign has engaged in a lot of research on the effects of nuclear weapons, and that was one of their strategies for drawing attention to the costs and risks of nuclear weapons. So, agricultural famine and nuclear winter. And part of this was a political strategy to mobilize non-nuclear states who might not otherwise have an interest in the ban campaign, to say that this would affect them. One of the responses to all this new research was, what are they telling us that we didn't already know, right? We know that use of nuclear weapons would be a catastrophe, right? We know they're bad, right? What is this telling us that we don't already know? And I think it is important, right? It does remind us, actually, what the actual consequences would be of nuclear weapons. And I think as the memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki become more remote, we face an issue of nuclear forgetting, that the people who remember this, right, are passing on, that generation is passing on. And it's not a sort of a visual memory anymore, right? And so talking about the actual costs and the scenarios is really important. Now, I think the new issue of an exchange of low-yield nuclear weapons in Europe, I mean, the new old issue, right? This is the old issue in Europe, coming back again. Again, I think it's important to remind people what a low-yield nuclear weapon is and what the most likely scenarios would be. People have to game these out, right? What would a nuclear exchange look like in a bunch of different ways, and do all the estimates and play out all the consequences. I mean, these weapons are about the size of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, right? They're not teeny. And so I think it's very important to remind people. I mean, we have to remind and teach the new generation of young people what the consequences of these weapons are. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, can I just add? Well, two things. One is there is a question of new research in terms of, a lot of this research was done sort of in the height of the Cold War, and there's been questions about whether, the analysis needs updating in terms of some of the work Lynn Eden has done in terms of effective fire and that kind of thing. So that's one question is, is there actually a need for new? And then there's also a question of, do we need to educate new people about the existing knowledge? in terms of what's already known about consequences. And I agree with Nina about some, I mean, I'd be interested in myself, but some, focused research and publications on the consequences of what we call smaller yield weapons, and kind of relating that to some discussion of, imagining political, remember, I mean, wars, it's about a political end, so what's the political end, and then, how does the consequence of the actual use affect that? I mean, you look at something like the Chernobyl accident, that area is still uninhabitable after,
Yeah.
a nuclear power plant accident, how many years ago? And so, you have to think about sort of what political end is being pursued where this could actually be used, and then what's the consequence, not only the immediate consequence to lives and the environment and the economy, but sort of your ultimate political objective. And which hearts and minds did you win when you did that? Or what land did you inherit, and how's that working out for you? Or
For me, what's interesting is, I mean, I'm always interested in more research on what does the use of nuclear weapons mean. You're talking to the converted here, right? So we're already motivated by these things. I think it's an interesting question. Is there anything that will motivate the public on nuclear? And I'm pessimistic there when it comes to research, but I'm optimistic when it comes to the use of new technology and new communication tools. So, for example, it's plausible that you could have a flash mob in Portland so that everybody within a certain radius at a certain time of day would just fall down. I mean, tens of thousands of people. You could organize that. And knock it up for the rest of the day and see what that does to economic, vitality in downtown Portland. Mayor of Portland probably won't like that, so I apologize if Portland's watching. So virtual reality, how do you, the most powerful thing, I would argue, in the early 1980s that changed the course of nuclear affairs was a movie, The Day After, and Special Report. So what's the next version? We all grasp at this, and you got here a lot of years of effort thinking, what would be the right visualization? How would we communicate the intensity and horror of these things? The problem is that human beings forget. Right?
It's also that was a political environment when people actually worried about it. I mean, it was interesting that the false alarm in Hawaii at a time when tensions were high with North Korea, just, when was that? Last summer?
Not that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago, but I mean, people were scared. I mean, people were running for their lives. People really thought this was real. And I think it was the first time in a long time that it really, brought it home for a small group of Americans. But that's not the normal situation.
Right.
I mean, most.
But if CNN
I
ran
bet none of
Special
you
Report today,
actually
people
have
would believe it.
worried that
Donald
this.
Trump, decided, So, but what is the right tool there? I think the environment's there, unfortunately. But in terms of new technology that is more interesting to me than the rising sea levels. Or one last caveat, because obviously the people who work on Beyond the Bomb, part of Global Zero, really engaged in sort of intersectionality of these communities. What is motivating new groups of people is how the use of nuclear weapons would deny the exercise of democracy. In the United States, if a nuclear weapon went off, what would happen to American society? Would there be martial law? What sort of government would you have? Would the United States citizens be able to petition their government for redress of grievances, right? Environmental justice, disenfranchisement. These are all issues that I think there's a lot of discussion going on now as the possibility that power will shift in the United States to include new communities, which from a democratic point of view is a great thing, and how nuclear weapons would actually reverse that trend. That's sort of an interesting area that I think is worth mining, that we're spending some time on.
We could go on, but the lights are dimming in the foyer, which tells me that we need to get you out of the building, the Stimson Center's world headquarters. I want to thank Nina and Lynn and Jon for helping us brainstorm. We need more thinking out loud. And we will have it thanks to the largesse of the MacArthur Foundation. God bless the MacArthur Foundation. So we're going to continue to do these brainstorming sessions, trying to answer these two large questions. What do we do now? And what do we call it? Because what do we call it helps us in mobilizing support for what we do now. Thank you all for coming. Much appreciated. Travel safely.
You're right on the norm of nuclear safety and security.
Yeah,
I didn't mention it, but I agree.
sir.
Sure, I'm gonna go to our holiday party, but thanks for
Get on to it.
Nice to see you. See you in Italy.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao, yeah, soon. Oh, thank you. Special advisor for Arm Control, very good.
Actually, I'm doing a station.
Are you really? Where are you doing this? At where?
University in Japan.
In Japan,
Actually, this is my 7th year. Taking so long, but I'm about to finish it. I was going to say Deterrence Norm.
Can I? So I have a paper, yeah, I do have a paper on that, yeah. It's the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Daedalus. If I can send it to you, if you would like me to email this to you, there's your